The collective is pleased by your arrival. We have prepared living quarters according to the specifications you sent. Will you follow to the diplomatic sector? Jihu nodded, and the group began moving through corridors that seemed to be alive with light and gentle motion. More Lumi passed them in the hallways, all unclothed, their skin displaying unique patterns that Jihu began to suspect might have meaning beyond mere decoration. When they reached their quarters, Jihu was relieved to find the living spaces matched human needs quite well, with furniture proportioned for Earth physiology and environmental controls set to Earth normal temperature and humidity. Rest cycle begins in 2 units, Telu explained. We will gather for formal introductions after. Your nutritional needs have been provided for. Telu gestured to what appeared to be a food preparation area. After the Lumi left, Captain Lee immediately turned to Jihu. Doctor, you didn't mention they would be. He paused, searching for a diplomatic term. Unclothed. I didn't know, Jihu admitted. None of our communications included visual elements that would have revealed this aspect of their culture. The security officers looked uncomfortable. One of them, Officer Min, spoke up. Is this going to be a problem for the mission? Jihu considered the question carefully. I don't think so. Different species have different cultural norms. Our job is to bridge those differences. Later, alone in his quarters, Jihu opened his tablet and began making notes. He typed, Lumi appear to have no concept of clothing or modesty as humans understand it. Their skin appears to serve functions beyond protection, possibly communication, status indication, or emotional expression. He paused, then added, must determine if our clothing is perceived negatively or simply as a curiosity. Cultural exchange will require careful navigation of this fundamental difference. A soft chime from his communicator interrupted his thoughts. It was a message from Earth, from his research assistant, Hannah Kim. First contact established. How did it go? Her message read. Jihu stared at the screen for a long moment before typing his reply. Contact established. The Lumi are everything we hoped for. Intelligent, peaceful, advanced. But there's something our research never uncovered. They have no concept of clothing. Not ceremonial, not functional. Nothing. He hit send, then added, tomorrow I need to explain the concept of human modesty to beings who display themselves completely openly. This may be the most challenging translation I've ever attempted. As he prepared for sleep, Jihu realized that true first contact wasn't just about meeting alien life. It was about facing the unexpected ways intelligent beings could differ from humans. The real work of bridging their worlds was just beginning. Jihu woke to the soft chime of his room's communication system. The panel beside his bed displayed a message from Telu. Morning meal in shared space when you are prepared. He quickly dressed in his formal diplomatic uniform, spent extra time making sure it was perfectly arranged, then stepped into the hallway. The station's curved corridors pulsed with subtle light patterns that seemed to guide him toward the meeting area. When he arrived, 3 Lumi were already present. Telu's distinctive pattern of blue-green swirls identified them immediately. The other 2 Lumi had skin patterns Jihu hadn't seen before, one with geometric shapes and amber tones, the other with rippling waves of purple. Earth Human Jihu, Telu greeted. These are Elder Moru and Knowledge Keeper Saul. They wished to join our breaking of fast. Jihu bowed slightly. I am honored to meet you both. Elder Moru's skin flashed with rapid pulses that the translator converted. We are curious about your external coverings. Do they change with your status or emotional state? Jihu glanced down at his uniform. He hadn't expected clothing to be their first topic of conversation, but perhaps he should have. Yes, in a way, he explained. This is a formal uniform that represents my role as Earth's diplomat. Humans wear different coverings for different purposes and situations. Saul moved closer, circling Jihu with evident curiosity. May we observe the material? Jihu stood still as Saul extended a hand toward his sleeve, stopping just short of touching it. Of course. Fascinating. Saul's skin rippled with patterns that reminded Jehu of text scrolling across a screen. The material does not respond to your biological signals. How do other humans know your thoughts or intentions? We communicate primarily through words, facial expressions, and body language, Jehu explained. Our clothing mainly serves practical purposes: protection, temperature regulation, and social convention. Moru's skin darkened slightly. Social convention. You conceal your true form from others of your kind. Jehu realized he was entering complex cultural territory. Humans view certain body parts as private. Showing them is generally reserved for intimate relationships or specific contexts. The three Lumi went completely still, their skin patterns freezing momentarily before erupting in rapid, complex displays. The translator struggled to keep up, producing only fragments. Deception, hidden forms, trust implications. Telu finally addressed Jehu directly. This is unexpected information. Lumi philosophy holds that one's form should be honestly presented at all times. To hide one's physical self suggests one might also hide intentions. Jehu felt a chill of concern. I assure you, our customs around clothing have nothing to do with deception. They're about privacy and context-appropriate behavior. Privacy. Moru's skin flashed patterns of confusion. Why would a being wish to be unknown to others? Before Jehu could answer, servants arrived with food. At least what Jehu assumed was food. Glass-like containers held colorful substances with textures ranging from liquid to solid. As they ate, Jehu tried to explain human concepts of personal space and privacy, but the more he talked, the more concerned the Lumi seemed to become. In your communications, Saul noted, you never mentioned this fundamental aspect of human behavior. Was this intentional concealment? Not at all, Jehu said quickly. It simply didn't occur to us that it would be significant. Humans take clothing for granted. After the meal, Jehu requested a private communication with Hannah back on Earth. When her face appeared on the screen, he immediately saw her concern. You look troubled, she said. I am. The Lumi view our clothing customs with suspicion. They see it as a form of deliberate concealment, possibly indicating untrustworthiness. Hannah frowned. That's unexpected. Have you explained human modesty concepts? I've tried, but our ideas don't translate well. Their skin patterns aren't just decorative. They're communicative. Imagine if humans wore masks that hid all facial expressions. That's how they seem to view our clothing. Hannah typed notes as he spoke. What about showing them historical records? Clothing has practical origins. Protection from elements. Carrying tools. Good idea. I'll request permission to share some cultural materials. Later that day, Jehu met with a larger group of Lumi in what appeared to be their version of a conference room. Using his tablet, he displayed images showing human clothing across history and cultures. As you can see, much of our clothing evolved for practical reasons, he explained, showing images of Arctic gear, desert robes, and protective work clothing. The Lumi watched with their skin flickering in patterns. Jehu was beginning to recognize as indicating interest, though his translator remained silent during these displays. One Lumi, whom Jehu hadn't met before, suddenly spoke up. If protection is the purpose, why continue wearing coverings in controlled environments where no protection is needed? It was a fair question. Over time, clothing became linked with social identity and cultural norms. What began as practical became meaningful in other ways. Moru, who had been silent until now, approached Jehu. May I ask you to remove your coverings? As a demonstration of trust. The room went silent. Jehu felt his heart rate increase. This preserves human modesty requirements while allowing Lumi to observe that we have nothing to physically hide. It's not perfect from either perspective, but it represents our willingness to adapt. The council members' skin patterns flashed in rapid, complex sequences as they communicated among themselves. Finally, Binny spoke. Your creative approach shows willingness to find middle ground. However, some council members remained concerned. Would you be willing to demonstrate this compromise yourself? Jehu swallowed hard. This was the moment he had been dreading. Yes, I have already created a prototype of the garment. With your permission, I will wear it to our next meeting. Back in his quarters, Jehu examined the transparent bodysuit he had designed. The material, a special polymer from the ship's fabricator, was just opaque enough to satisfy human modesty while revealing the general form beneath. He had never imagined when he embarked on this mission that he would be pioneering interspecies diplomacy through advanced clothing design. His communication panel chimed again. It was Captain Lee. Dr. Park, Earth Command has reviewed your proposed compromise. They're concerned. About what specifically? They worry you're making too many concessions. Some officials fear it sets a precedent that humans must conform to alien customs rather than maintaining our own values. Jehu frowned. Tell them this isn't about giving up our values. It's about finding creative ways to honor both cultures. If we insist on maintaining all our customs exactly as they are on Earth, we'll never forge meaningful connections with truly different species. The next day, Jehu stood outside the council chamber wearing the transparent bodysuit under a removable robe. His heart pounded as he considered what he was about to do. The robe would come off, leaving him feeling more exposed than he'd ever been in a professional setting. Yet something more important than his personal comfort was at stake. As he entered, he noticed more Lumi present than before, at least 20, their skin patterns displaying what his translator identified as curiosity and cautious optimism. Vini approached. Earth-human Jehu, we are prepared to witness your compromise solution. Taking a deep breath, Jehu removed the robe. The transparent bodysuit clung to his form, revealing his general physique while technically keeping him covered. On his wrist, the biometric display showed his elevated heart rate and stress levels. As promised, he said, fighting to keep his voice steady, a solution that respects both Lumi values of transparency and human needs for covering. The room filled with flickering light as the Lumi communicated rapidly with one another. Gradually, their patterns shifted to slower, more harmonious displays. Beanie stepped forward. Your discomfort is evident, yet you proceed. This demonstrates commitment that we recognize and respect. The Council will reconvene to discuss resuming treaty negotiations. That evening, Jehu received word that the Council had voted to continue diplomatic talks. His compromise, while not perfect, had opened the door to understanding. As he sent his report to Earth Command, Jehu realized that true diplomacy wasn't about maintaining rigid boundaries. It was about finding creative ways to bridge seemingly incompatible differences. Sometimes that meant stepping far outside one's comfort zone. Jehu followed Ambassador Telu through the curved corridors of the Lumi Research Complex. 2 weeks had passed since his compromise with the transparent bodysuit, and while treaty talks had resumed, he still sensed hesitation among some Lumi officials. Today's tour of their biotech facilities was meant to build trust through knowledge sharing. This sector houses our agricultural development, Telu explained as they entered a vast chamber filled with strange, glowing plants. We engineer these organisms to produce nutrients efficiently in space environments. Jehu was impressed. The plants pulsed with gentle light, much like Lumi skin. The bioluminescence, is it related to the patterns on your bodies? Yes, Telu replied. Most life forms from our world evolved with photosynthetic and communication capabilities simultaneously. We merely enhanced what nature began. As they continued through the facility, Jehu noticed something odd. A Lumi technician working at a control panel suddenly displayed a completely different skin pattern when passing through a particular corridor. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. The flowing waves of green and blue briefly transformed into angular patterns of red and orange before returning to their original state. Jehu blinked, wondering if he had imagined it. But no, he observed the same phenomenon with 2 other Lumi scientists who passed through the same area. Is something troubling you, Earth-human Jehu? Telu asked, noticing his distraction. Jihu hesitated. I'm curious about something I observed, but I'm not sure how to ask without seeming intrusive. Please ask freely. Open inquiry is valued here. I noticed that several Lumi displayed different skin patterns when passing through that corridor. Is there something significant about that area? Telu went completely still, their skin pattern freezing momentarily before displaying rapid pulses that the translator couldn't interpret. After a moment, Telu spoke carefully. You have very observant eyes for one not raised among us. The comment wasn't exactly an answer. Jihu sensed he had touched on something sensitive. Perhaps we should continue the tour, Telu suggested, guiding him toward another section. Later that day, Jihu was working in his quarters when his door chimed. He was surprised to find a young Luma waiting outside, one he recognized from the research facility, but hadn't been formally introduced to. Earth-human Jihu. The Lumi said softly, I am Du-Su, Junior Science Liaison. May I enter? What I wish to discuss should not occur in public spaces. Intrigued and slightly concerned, Jihu invited them in. Du-Su's skin displayed nervous patterns, rapid, jittery pulses of yellow and white. What I am about to share may impact your diplomatic mission, Du-Su began. Your observation today in the research facility revealed something most visitors are not meant to notice. Jihu leaned forward. The changing skin patterns in the corridor. Yes, that passage contains what we call a truth field, a subtle energy barrier that temporarily disrupts voluntary skin pattern control. Jihu frowned. Voluntary control. I thought your skin patterns were automatic responses, like human facial expressions. They are, partially. But with training, we can moderate or alter our displays to some degree. Most commonly, this is done for courtesy, like how humans might smile politely even when not happy. But the truth field prevents this control. Du-Su's patterns darkened. Yes, it ensures that only those displaying their true intentions can access sensitive research areas. Jihu felt a chill run down his spine as the implications became clear. So Lumi can hide their true feelings or intentions with their skin patterns, just as humans might with facial expressions or body language. Not all Lumi approve of such practices, Du-Su said quickly. But yes, it is possible, and some among us. They paused, skin showing patterns of distress. Some believe that alliance with Earth threatens our way of life. They fear outside influence and work to undermine the treaty process. Are you saying there are Lumi actively working against the alliance? A small faction, yes. They have representatives on the council itself. Jihu sat back, mind racing. This revelation changed everything he thought he understood about Lumi culture. Their insistence on physical transparency wasn't just a cultural preference, it was a societal safeguard against deception within their own species. Why are you telling me this? Jihu asked. Because I believe in the alliance, Du-Su replied. And because your compromise solution impressed many of us. You found a way to honor our values while maintaining your own. It showed wisdom few expected from humans. Jihu thought carefully before speaking. This faction against the alliance, are they the ones who pushed hardest against human clothing customs? Yes, they used your cultural difference to create distrust and delay negotiations. Thank you for this information, Jihu said. But I'm not sure how to use it without creating more problems. Du-Su's patterns shifted to something more determined. Tomorrow at the diplomatic gathering, Elder Zin will challenge the alliance again. He will claim humans cannot be trusted due to your covering practices. When he does, observe his patterns carefully through your translator's visual enhancement. You will see the signs of voluntary control. After Du-Su left, Jihu spent hours researching Lumi's skin patterns through the cultural database he had access to. What he had initially interpreted as a straightforward biological communication system was actually far more complex. Luma's skin patterns had layers of meaning, some automatic and involuntary, others learned and controllable. By morning, Jihu had developed a theory that might save the alliance, but testing it would be risky. If he was wrong, he could offend the entire Lumi Council and end negotiations permanently. At the diplomatic gathering that evening, Jihu wore his transparent bodysuit as promised, but he had made one crucial modification. Around his neck hung a small pendant containing a miniature version of the truth field technology, calibrated to only affect a small area around him. As Du-Su had predicted, Elder Zen rose to address the gathering. While we value the effort of Earth-human Jihu to accommodate our customs, we must consider whether any species that evolved to hide their physical form can truly be trusted with our knowledge and resources. Jihu watched carefully through his enhanced visualizer. Sure enough, Zen's pattern showed subtle signs of manipulation, tiny inconsistencies in the flow of colors that indicated conscious control rather than natural expression. Jihu stood to respond. Honored Council, I have learned something important about our cultural misunderstanding. Your unclothed state isn't simply a custom. It's a communication system, a language of patterns that conveys identity, emotion, and intention. He stepped closer to Zen, the pendant's field now subtly affecting the elder's skin patterns. And like any language, it can be used truthfully or otherwise. Zen's patterns suddenly shifted, the controlled display giving way to chaotic bursts of color that revealed his true emotional state: anger, fear, and deception. The council chamber erupted in flashes of surprise and alarm as other Lumi recognized what was happening. Jihu had exposed not just a faction against the Alliance, but a fundamental truth about Lumi society that explained their deep suspicion of human clothing. Council leader Benny approached, skin displaying patterns of solemn authority. Earth-human Jihu, you have revealed a truth we ourselves have been reluctant to acknowledge. Perhaps we are not so different after all. The Lumi-human treaty signing ceremony took place 1 month after Jihu's revelation. The grand chamber glowed with soft blues and greens, colors the Lumi associated with trust and cooperation. Jihu stood before the assembled dignitaries wearing a new type of garment, a lightweight bodysuit made of a special material that changed color slightly in response to his emotional state, while still providing human-appropriate coverage. Council leader Benny approached the central platform, skin displaying formal patterns of deep blue interlaced with gold. Today marks the beginning of a new relationship between our peoples, one built on understanding rather than assumption. Jihu stepped forward when indicated, aware of the historical significance of this moment. On behalf of Earth, I am honored to formalize our alliance. As they pressed their hands to the treaty document, a blend of traditional paper and living Lumi biotech, Jihu reflected on how much had changed in a few short weeks. After the exposure of Elder Zen's deception, the Lumi Council had been forced to acknowledge a difficult truth. Their society's emphasis on physical transparency had evolved precisely because Lumi could, with practice and effort, control their skin patterns to hide their true feelings. What Jihu had initially misunderstood as a simple cultural difference was actually a complex social adaptation with a purpose similar to human concepts of honesty and integrity. The document is sealed, announced Telu, who had been promoted to chief liaison after helping uncover Zen's conspiracy. Our worlds are now officially allied. Applause and flashing skin patterns filled the room as both human and Lumi delegates celebrated. Later, at the reception, Jihu found himself approached by many curious Luma who wanted to examine his new responsive clothing more closely. "The material changes with your emotional state?" asked a young Lumi scientist. "To a limited degree," Jihu explained. "It's not as sophisticated as your natural abilities, but it demonstrates our commitment to transparency while respecting human needs for covering." Du-Su joined them, now wearing a formal insignia marking their new role as cultural exchange officer. The design is already being called Park Pattern among our people. Several Luma working with humans have expressed interest in creating partial coverings that incorporate similar technology. Jihu laughed. "So I've started a fashion trend." "You've started much more than that," said a voice behind him. Jihu turned to see Hana, who had arrived with the diplomatic delegation from Earth. The adaptive clothing concept is being developed for use with other species too. The Galactic Council is impressed with how we resolved what could have been a diplomatic disaster. Jehu was still getting used to the idea that Earth was now in contact with a larger community of spacefaring civilizations, all introduced through the Lumi. I never expected my work to involve clothing design. It wasn't about clothing, Council Leader Benny said, joining their conversation. It was about finding the meaning behind the custom. Both our peoples evolved ways to protect ourselves. Yours through physical coverings, ours through our emphasis on displaying true patterns. Beanie's skin shifted to show patterns of formal respect. Your willingness to understand, rather than merely accommodate, has earned you great honor among the Lumi. 6 months later, Jehu stood in the New Earth Embassy on the Lumi station, looking out at the stars through the observation window. Behind him, a group of human scientists was receiving instruction from Lumi teachers about their biotechnology. The humans wore lightweight versions of what was now officially called Park Protocol clothing, garments that provided coverage while incorporating elements that responded to emotional states. Telu entered the room and approached Jehu. The first Lumi delegation will depart for Earth next week. They are nervous about visiting a world where most beings are covered. Jehu smiled. They'll adjust, just as I did here. The accommodation garments your designers created are beautiful. They show respect for human customs while preserving Lumi communication needs. Balance between different ways of being, Telu said, their skin showing thoughtful patterns. This is the true achievement of our alliance. Jehu nodded. When I first arrived and saw all of you without clothing, I was shocked. I never imagined that misunderstanding would lead to such a profound exchange of cultural wisdom. The Council has a request, Telu said. They wish you to establish a permanent cultural interpretation office to help prevent similar misunderstandings with other species. I'd be honored, Jehu replied. Though I hope my next assignment doesn't involve quite so much personal discomfort. Telu's skin flickered with patterns of amusement. Perhaps next time, the challenge will be a species that finds verbal communication offensive, and you will need to remain silent for months. I think I'd prefer the nudity challenge, Jehu laughed. 1 year after first contact, Jehu stood before a class of new human diplomats in the Earth Lumi Cultural Exchange Academy, which occupied an entire section of the expanded Lumi station. The most important lesson from our first contact with the Lumi is this, he told the attentive students. What appears to be a simple cultural difference may have deep evolutionary and social reasons behind it. The Lumi didn't go without clothing because they lacked modesty. They did it because their society valued honest communication above all else. A student raised her hand. But didn't you discover they could control their patterns anyway? So their whole system wasn't foolproof. Exactly, Jehu said, which is why their cultural emphasis on it was so strong. Just as humans developed elaborate social rules around honesty because lying is possible, the Lumi developed cultural rules around pattern display because control was possible. Another student asked, is it true some Lumi now wear clothing when not in formal settings? Yes, Jehu confirmed. Just as humans learn to adapt, some Lumi have found value in certain aspects of covering. Cultural exchange goes both ways. Neither side remains unchanged. After class, Jehu returned to his quarters, where he kept a frame displaying his first transparent bodysuit, now considered a historic artifact. Beside it hung the traditional Lumi honor pattern, a permanent display showing the unique skin pattern the Lumi Council had created to commemorate his contribution to interspecies understanding. His communication panel chimed with a message from Hannah. New species contact initiated through Lumi networks. The Vorasi communicate through scent patterns and find visual communication confusing. Council requests your expertise for first contact preparation. Jehu smiled as he read the message. Every new species brought challenges, but also opportunities for growth and understanding. The universe was vast and filled with different ways of being, and humanity was just beginning to discover how to connect across those differences. He sent a quick reply. Tell them I'll be ready. and suggest they bring nose plugs, just in case.